Hi everyone, this is Izzy from Minerva. In today's sew along, we're going to be doing the Montana dress by Style Arc Patterns. Now this is one of our Minerva kits, so if you purchased the kit, that's the one that we'll be using today. There are a lot of different options to sew up this dress, so take a good look at it and decide which one you would like to sew. We are going to be sewing bodice B and sleeve 1 in today's tutorial. In the sew along today, we're going to be following the instructions step by step so you can easily follow along. And to facilitate that, we've put some little numbers in the bottom of the screen so that you can see exactly which step we're up to at different times. And obviously, as always, if you've got any comments, please do just post them in the video, in the comments below the video. We always love to hear from you. The original Montana dress pattern, which is this one, is a high-waisted dress, which you can just pull on over your head, and it has an extended shoulder seam, so it just nicely comes across your shoulder like that, with no sleeves to inset. Now the skirt has slight gathers around the high waist, which then just fall into a lovely midi dress. The skirt also has inseam pockets, which is always a favourite with the sewing community. In the Minerva pack that we provide for you, we also provide the extension pack, and this pack has, as you can see, 4 different bodice types. So one sleeveless, you've got the V-neck, you've got a high collar, and then you've got a button up front, and also 3 different sleeve options. So you've got one which has a long sleeve with an elasticated cuff, another one with a long sleeve with a flared cuff, and another one with elbow length sleeve. So with this one pack, you can make 12 different styles of the pattern, which is really, really cool and really flexible. This pattern is also available in US size 4 to 36. Style Arc recommend the following types of fabric for this pattern. They recommend washed linen, rayon, crepe, or even knit fabric for the basic pack, and they recommend woven fabric for the extension packs. In your Minerva kit, you've got loads of goodies with this pattern. So to start off with, we've got the original pattern, which is the standard basic pattern, and that is the one with the dress and just one bodice option. So that's just one piece of AO. Then you also have all the options for the extension pack. So that's a number of AO sheets, and that comes with all the different bodice types, A, B, C, D, and the 3 different sleeve types, 1, 2, and 3. Along with that, then you've also got your interfacing, which will be really important for around the neckline. We've got our Minerva Maker little label, which will be sewing into the back. We've got a set of sewing machine needles, and these are medium needles. And then you've also got your fabric, which is our Minerva Exclusive Viscose Challis fabric. Absolutely gorgeous colours, a really bold print, and perfect for the summer. I can't wait to sew with that. Now, depending on which version of the bodice top and sleeve you're going to use, your pack contains some elastic if you're going to be using the elastic cuff feature detail, which is the one that I'll be doing today. You've also got a number of buttons if you're going to be doing the bodice D, which is the one with the buttons down the front. So those actually work really nicely with the fabric. It's a really lovely colour, just blends in really beautifully. And then obviously everyone is using the same type of thread, so that blends in really nicely with the fabric. The original Montana pattern just comes with one AO sheet. There is no instruction booklet because the instructions are actually written inside and on the sheet of paper. So the instructions come with 4 sort of sets of instructions, page 1, 2, 3 and 4. This is obviously just for the original dress. We're going to have a look at the extension instructions on the extension pack in a few minutes. There are some really helpful hints at the top of the midi dress instructions on page 2, and then the finished measurement of the dress is also listed here. Now, if you're one of those people who likes to know the body size that the dress pattern sizes is based on, you can pop over to the Style Arc website, and they've got their body size charts there as well. So have a look at that, and also have a look at the finished garment size to determine which size you want to cut out. There are a number of different pattern pieces for this dress. There's 7 of them in total. If you're just using the skirt from this and you're going to use the bodice on the extension pack, the only pieces you'll need are pieces 3 and the pocket piece 4. There are also a series of lay charts here which are just for the original pattern dress. If you're doing the extension for the bodice and the sleeves, obviously we will have a slightly different lay plan depending on which option you go for. The construction instructions of the dress are listed here. So this is for the bodice. So steps 1 to 6 for the bodice. And then for the skirt and pockets, it's steps 7 to 11. So in this sew along, we're going to be doing the extension bodice top, bodice B, and sleeve 1. So the only aspect of the original pattern pack that we're going to be using is pattern pieces 3 and 4 and instructions steps 7 to 11. What's really nice about the style art patterns for the Montana dress is that the sizes all come printed in different colours, so it's pretty easy to see which size to cut out. Now the extension pack comes with 2 sheets of paper and the instructions are just on the first one, page 1. So you can see the different extension options by looking at this little image here. Again, we've got a size chart here. This is slightly different because the bodices are fit slightly differently. And then we've got our extension pack pattern pieces. So take some time to look at this. Make sure you know which ones you're cutting out for your version. For us, we are going to be cutting out pattern piece 1 and the corresponding 3, number 5 and 6, and 17 for the sleeve. We've got a series of different lay plans here which are really helpful. We'll be using bodice B, which is this lay plan here, and sleeve 1, which is this one here. In terms of the actual construction of the garment, there are a series of different steps that you can follow based on which bodice option and sleeve option you're choosing. So the instructions for bodice A are here, B here, C here, and D here, and your different sleeve options 1, 2 and 3 are there. We will be following bodice B, steps 1 to 14, and then sleeve 1, which is steps 1 to 6. All right, so once you've decided which pattern pieces you need to cut out, which version you're doing, off to the cutting table, cut out your fabric, and then come and join me. In today's sew along, we're going to be using the following pattern pieces. These ones are both from the main dress pattern pack, and this is pattern piece 3, which is the skirt, and we're going to cut 2 of those on the fold. And then we've also got pattern piece 4, which is the pockets. I need to cut 2 pairs using the main fabric. Now what that means is you need to cut 4 pieces in total. From the pattern extension pack, we're going to be using the following pieces, which is for bodice B, we've got the back. We're going to cut 1 on the fold, and then we've got the corresponding back facing. We're only going to cut 1 of these, so 1 in the fabric and 1 in the interfacing, or the fuse as it calls it here. And then we've got bodice B, which is just cut 1 pair, so cut 2 of those. And then we've got the bodice facing. We're going to cut 2 of those and also 2 of the interfacing or the fusing as well. And then finally we have the sleeve option 1, and that's pattern piece 17. Make sure that on all your pattern pieces you have marked the notches. Now the seam allowance on this pattern piece is only 1 centimetre, so if you're snipping into your fabric to create a mark where the notch is on the pattern piece, make sure that you only snip about 0.5 centimetre deep into the fabric, into the seam allowance, because you've only obviously got a 1 centimetre seam allowance. We've obviously got 2 sets of instructions to be following here. So the original pattern instructions start off by sewing the bodice. So we're going to do that too, except for our bodice is going to be using our dress extension pack instructions. And because we are using bodice piece B, we're going to be going straight to the instructions which are here, which is bodice V, the V-neck bodice. To start off with, we just need to prepare all of our pattern pieces. So in order to do this, the first thing we're going to do is interface or fuse our facing pieces. We have a bubbly side of the interfacing, which has a texture to it, and that's the side that has the glue on, which needs to transfer and be pressed up against the wrong side of the fabric. So lay the interfacing or fusing down on the ironing board with the textured side facing up. Place the wrong side of your fabric on top of that, and then gently iron. To do this, we put the iron on a setting which is suitable for the fabric, and we turn off the steam. We're going to pick up the iron and just place it on top of the pattern pieces. We're not going to be moving the iron around too much, because if we do that it will distort how the pattern pieces are sitting, and we want them to fuse really nice and flat to the interfacing. So lift up your iron, pop it down, hold it there for a few seconds, pick it up and move it on to the next place. So we'll do that for our back facing and also our front facing two pieces. The next thing we need to do to prepare the pattern pieces is to get your bodice piece, which is pattern piece 15, and actually just transfer these darts. Okay, so we're going to follow whatever colour dart is the one that you need to be following. So in order to do that, the point of the dart is down here. So I'm just going to poke a little hole in the pattern piece there, and because I've got the wrong side of my fabric facing up, I'm just going to mark a little dot there using my washable pen. I've also cut the two notches here and here, so I know where that line needs to join up to. But do that on that side. I'll take off my pins so I can see my little dot, which is right there. I'm going to get my ruler and just line these up with the notch. So the dot's there and the notch is here. I'm just going to draw that line on. So that's one side of the V, the other little notch is here, so I'm just going to rotate the ruler around and join that up. Flip the pattern piece over and just do the same on the other side. Step 1 says to sew the bust darts and press them down, so we'll do that now. We've got two corresponding front bodice pattern pieces and two darts to sew. So we're just going to pinch it at the point and then line up the two notches on this side just to make that little triangle halved nicely, and then just pin it in place. We're just pinning it along this line and then flipping it onto the other side to check that the pin is still aligned with the line that we've drawn. Okay, so pop a pin in there and then pop another one in here. Once you've added that pin, just check that the pin is still following the line on the other side. We're then going to sew starting at one end and going up to the point. We're going to start with a long stitch length here, or a standard stitch length of 2.5mm, and then gradually we're going to make that stitch length smaller and smaller until we get to the point. Now by the time we hit the point, we're looking at probably using a top stitching stitch length of about 1.8, 1.6mm long. What that does is it just creates a really nice consistent dart going all the way up to the point. The point is obviously where it's the most fitted, so that's the area that we want to have really tight little stitches, because the pull is going to be the most around the apex of the bust at that point. We're going to follow the line that we've drawn on the pattern piece using our washable pen, and we're using a stitch length of 2.5mm, so standard stitch length. Reinforce the stitch at the beginning and continue in a straight line. It's a good idea to mark the end of the dart to make sure you know where you're aiming for. And at this point you can start to reduce the length of your stitches gradually. When you hit the end of the dart, you're just going to sew off. Do not need to reinforce the stitches, otherwise you'll create a big bulk. Pull off the thread and just cut it so that you've got enough thread here to then tie a series of knots. We don't want to reinforce the stitches at the end of the dart because it will create a little bit of a bulk, which means you end up with a point once you've sewn your dart. So just tie that off using 2 or 3 knots. Repeat that process for the second dart. So once we've sewn those darts in here, we then want to press the dart down towards the waistband. But what we don't want to do is to create a really sharp edge. So I'm going to use my tailor's ham and just place the fabric with the point just over the curve like that. And then I'm just going to press that down. At that point, that also removes any of the markings of the pen, which is very convenient. Just make sure you've got a nice soft curve. Repeat that process for the other pattern piece. Step 2 says to attach the front bodice to the back bodice, which is piece 1 for us of the extension pack, along the shoulder seams at this point. So I'm going to open up my back pattern piece and lay one of my front pattern pieces with right sides together, just aligning these shoulder seams up here nicely. Make sure that you've got the dart on the side at that point, and that the V is coming into the middle like that. Just going to twist that around so that I can pin in my shoulders nicely. Now the fabric is quite delicate, so if it's moved and shifted around a little bit since you cut it, that's okay. You may just want to add a few extra pins just to make sure that it's all aligning nicely. Pin the other shoulder seam at the same time. Once we've pinned our shoulders, we're then going to sew with a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way along. You can do it on one shoulder and then on the other. We're going to use a standard stitch length, 2.5mm long. Once you've finished your 2 shoulder seams by sewing them, we then need to finish the seams. So you can do that in a number of different ways. In today's tutorial, we're just going to use an overlocker to finish the seams nicely, but you can use pinking shears, which have got a zigzag edge, and just trim the seam allowance by carefully snipping just along the edge. Or you can use a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine just to zigzag over the top of the raw ends, so it just helps to encase them. But we'll be using an overlocker today. And next we're just going to press those seam allowances towards the back. In step 3, we're going to do right sides together and sew the fused front and back facing shoulder seams together. So right sides together, pin those together at the top, and again on this side. I'm pinning at 90 degrees to the fabric raw edge because that means that no matter which way round I sew the fabric in my sewing machine, I can easily pin them, pull out the pins. And we've also sewn it, make sure that you pin it in the way that I've got here. So we've got our neckline here, which is the back neckline, and then this is our front neckline here, which is the V, and they'll ultimately be joined together. We sew it like this and not the other way around, simply because when we flip it the right side out, the curve of the neckline continues. If this one had been pinned on there, the neckline would have continued out, which is not what we want. Once you've sewn those 2 seams along the facing, we're just going to press the seams open. Step 4, with right sides together, sew the centre front bodice seams together, stopping at the star notch, which is 6mm, before the neck edge, and then press open. So we're going to turn that over so that the right sides are together, and it's just along this centre front seam that we are going to pin. Now if you're not sure where your notch is, or it's ironed off, where your star notch is, you can see it on the pattern piece. So if you lay the pattern piece back over the pattern, you should be able to see where your star is. So it will be right there for us. So now we're going to sew from the bottom up to that point, and that's it, using a standard seam allowance. Once you've sewn that centre front, we're then just going to press it open using our iron. In step 5, with right sides together, we're going to sew the centre front facing seams together, stopping again at the star notch, which is 6mm before the neck edge, and then we'll press it open. So this is our facing piece, and with right sides together, I'm just going to pin that. And once again, if you're not sure where your star notch is, you can just mark that again by getting your pattern piece out and marking it on. And now we're just going to sew from there down to there. Once you've sewn that seam, we're then just going to press that seam open. 5, we're going to sew the facing onto the main bodice piece. We're going to sew it right sides together, so lift that up and pop that on top. We're going to line up the centre seam of both the facing and the bodice. Make sure that's really beautifully lined up and just pin it in place, making sure that your seam allowances are sitting flat on both sides of the garment. The next area you want to pin in place is going to be the shoulder seam, making sure that the shoulder seam on the bodice is pinned to be facing towards the back and the facing one is open. Just do the same for the other shoulder seam as well, making sure you're just lining that all up beautifully. Now when we stitch these two together, we're going to be stitching them together with just a 6mm seam allowance all the way around. So do make sure that you're getting your raw edges of both the facing and the main garment really nicely lined up together. Once you've got those key points, those key 3 points lined up, then just continue to pin all the way around the rest of this neckline. Might find it easier to flip the fabric over possibly, just to get that ease in the back of the neck sorted. Obviously because the facing has got the interfacing or fusing on it, that's going to stay really rigid, but our fabric here, because it's viscose, it's very movable, so it might have just shifted out of shape a little bit. So just make sure you're getting that ease in as required around the back of the neck. Once you've pinned all of that in place, we're going to sew all the way around the neckline from the centre front here, all the way around using only a 6mm seam allowance. Once you've sewn your lining to your bodice, just go around the neckline quickly and just check that your fabric is definitely caught on both sides and that seam is catching both pieces of fabric, so you're not going to get any holes or gaps. In a few steps time, we're just going to be flipping this facing underneath so that it's on that side, but we're going to get quite a lot of bulk here when we fold that under like that. So to alleviate the bulk of all of this bit of the seam allowance, we're just going to snip into the seam allowance. We're going to just snip into that bit and just trim away some of the bulk at that point. Just be really careful at this point that you're not going to be snipping through any of your stitches. In step 7, it asks us just to overlock all the way around the facing edge, so let's do that now. Step 8 asks us to understitch the seam that we've got here to the facing. So we're wanting to push the seam allowance towards the facing and then stitch the seam allowance to the facing. In order to make this process a little bit easier, we're just going to iron that in place. We're going to iron it, pushing the seam allowance towards the facing. So now that we've pushed that seam allowance towards the facing, we're just going to stitch on this side, on the facing side, and we're going to stitch a line of stitches just all the way along. We're going to stitch it on this side, facing up, and we're going to stitch on the facing side just 2 or 3 mil away from the folded edge. Let's do that now. This stitch is going to be 1.8 mil long, and we're going to stitch it all the way around the neckline, so off we go. At this point you can see that our stitch line is just a few mil away from the folded edge, and it's just holding the seam allowance down, pressed towards the facing. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just press this neckline in place. We're trying to make sure, or we are going to make sure, that none of the facing is showing on the right side. So to do this, I'm placing the garment with the wrong side facing up, and I'm just making sure that the facing is just rolled under slightly, and that understitching is just helping it as well, just to stay in place. So I'm just giving it a little iron all the way around. And while I'm doing that, I'm also just going to pin it a few times reasonably close to the edge. Again, this facing of the seam should line up beautifully with the seam on the front. Make sure you just pin that in place through all the layers of fabric. Now the tricky bit, as ever, will be this V shape down here, just getting that really nice and sharp. So just take your time with the ironing. Make sure you're really happy with that. Now just flip it over to the other side, make sure that you're happy with how that's looking. That's looking really nice along that front V, it's looking really nice and sharp, so I'm happy with that. Step 9 says to pin the facing to the bodice, which is what we've done, and once in place we want to sew a feature top stitch to the outer edges of the facing, taking care that the facing is pinned flat before sewing the top stitch all the way around. Now ideally when we do this, we actually want the fabric to be that way up on our sewing machine, because this is a top stitch which will be visible, and we want to know whereabouts we're going to be sewing all the way along there. Now the distance that we're wanting to top stitch on the other side from the folded edge here is, well, it's around where our overlocking stitch is, but here it's coming in at about 4.5 centimetres is where we want to be stitching it. So with right side facing up, I'm just going to pin it at 4.5 centimetres. Making sure just to pin the critical points like the shoulders, so those seams definitely stay in the right place. You really do want to get this nice and flat when you sew it, because it's around the neckline and everyone will see it when you're wearing it. Now once you've pinned it all the way around the neckline, flip it over and you can take out the holding pins that you popped in while you were ironing the facing down. The reason why we're taking these out now is simply because we don't want to sew over them accidentally with the sewing machine, because that can really damage our sewing machine. Okay, so once all of those are out, flip it back over again. The only other thing that you might want to just mark on for a bit of extra detail is where the pivot point at the bottom of the V is going to be. So in order to figure out where you're going to pivot your sewing machine to pick up on that angle, you're just going to mark out that 4.5 line. It's actually exactly where that pin is, obviously. Where that white pin is. And 4.5 from that V is, again, just exactly where that is. So actually, at that point, that's where my marker is. And in order just to pick up on that, I'm just going to pop another pin in there so I can see that's my pivot. And then again, same on this side. And again, I'm just going to pop a little pin in, so I know exactly where that pivot point is when I come to it. And that just means that your pivot point is going to be equal on the bottom of those V's on both sides. So we're going to go and stitch that now at 4.5 using our pins as a guide for the distance that we want to be sewing from the neckline and from the centre edge. We're going to use a 1.8mm stitch length because that's our top stitch length. When you get to the pivot point, just pick up the foot, leave the needle in, move the fabric around so that you're then on the trajectory to continue in a nice straight line around the neckline. If, like me, you have just forgotten to attach your Minerva label, take it off the sewing machine before it gets too late. So we're wanting our Minerva label to be our Minerva Maker label, just to be right in the middle of the back down here. We could just sew it flat onto that because our facing is big enough, but I think we'll just tuck it under there. Let's find out where the middle of that is to start off with and mark that with a little pin. So folding it in half like that, marking the centre with a little pin, laying it flat again. So that's our middle. Just going to pop that underneath the facing, between the facing and the outer layer, just making sure it's lining up nice and central and that it's sitting really nice and flat too. Beautiful. And the colours of this label just work really nicely, don't they, with the colours of the fabric. Look at that, gorgeous. Right, and then just pin that in place on this side so that it's going to stay there, making sure everything's staying nice and flat. And bring the fabric over to the other side. You can see where your label is there because of the pins. And then just measure off that 4.5 centimetre distance. Again, just making sure you're getting that bang on right. pop a few pins in if you want to, just to make sure it definitely stays in place. And then just pull out the pins from the other side. Now, once you've pinned it in place, just make sure that it's once again sitting nice and flat on this side and that you're happy with that. Right, let's continue where we were. So pop the neckline back in again, pick up that line of stitching, and off we go. I would recommend ironing the top stitching down. It just helps to seal those stitches in place, and for the fabric just to remember where it's supposed to be sitting. Now then, doesn't our little Minerva Maker label just look beautiful right there? Step 10 is one that we're going to skip, simply because step 10 is talking about binding the armhole if you're having a sleeveless version, but in this demo we're going to sew sleeve 1 onto our bodice. So skip step 10 and let's move on to step 11. Step 11 simply asks us with right sides together to fold the front over the back and to pin these two side seams here and here. So let's do that now. Using a standard 1 centimetre seam allowance, I'm now going to sew down both of those side seams. Once you've sewn those two side seams, you can then overlock them or finish them using your preferred method. Once you've overlocked those side seams, we're then just going to press them towards the back. So step 13 is basically asking us to finish off the sleeve if it's a sleeveless option, but because in this demo we're going to do sleeve option 1, we're going to ignore that step, and the next step, step 14, asks us to sew the skirt onto the bodice. However, I'm going to put the sleeves on first and then do the skirt all as one kind of section, so we're going to move on to do the sleeves next. Okay, so now we're moving on to the sleeves. We're going to be doing sleeve 1, so we're following this set of instructions at this point here. We're doing sleeve 1. Now the first instruction on our sleeve piece is to sew a line of stitching along the top of the sleeve head, which is basically a gathering stitch. So we're going to use a long stitch length, so that will be 4.5, 5mm long, and we're going to sew from this notch here to about over here. Now it looks like they might be missing a notch on this. I could be wrong, but when we look at the instructions, it simply says sew a large stitch to the head of the sleeve and to ease in slightly. On the actual instructions, it looks like there's a line of kind of thread here and another line of thread here. However, we've not got a notch at this point to tell us where to stop. If I was you, I would just fold the sleeve head down the middle. You've got a notch at the top to tell you where that is. You can see they're not going to line up exactly, but I can see that my notch is here on that one. That's where my notch is for the front. So my notch for the back is probably going to be around there. Mark that notch in. Okay, so we're going to do a gathering stitch, a long stitch length from this notch over to this one over here, which is here, and we're just going to sew that within the seam allowance. So our seam allowance for our sleeve is 1 centimetre. So our stitch length that we want to do with our basting stitches is going to be about 5mm off from the raw edge. So we're going to change our stitch length to be 4.5mm long, nice long stitch length. We're going to be sewing 5mm from the raw edge. We're going to reinforce the stitch at the beginning. We're going to sew to the other notch. We're not going to reinforce the stitch at this point. We're just going to pull it off and leave a nice long line of thread at that end. What that means is that we can then pull one of the strings later, one of the pieces of thread later, and it will just start to gather up really nicely for us. Okay, that will help us ease the head of the sleeve into the shoulder at this point. Once you've done that, do the same for the other one. Step 2 of the sleeve piece says with right sides together, we're just going to sew that underarm seam, which is this one down here. So let's pin it in place first. Once you've pinned one sleeve in place, it's quite efficient then just to pin the other one in place too. And then you can sew them both at the same time. Once you've pinned both those in place, you can then stitch them using a 1 cm seam allowance. And then once you've sewn those seams, we're then just going to finish them. Now in step 2, it does say next, once you've finished that seam allowance, is to press the seam allowance towards the back. Now on the pattern piece of the sleeve, you can see at this point here, it has one notch here which says front. So that's the notch that was marked on the sleeve, and then we put a double one at the back. So it's the one which was already on the sleeve pattern, which is a single notch, which is the front. So we're going to press it towards the back. I'm going to get my tailor's ham, pop that into the sleeve. If you've not got one of these, you can just tightly roll up a towel into a nice little cylinder and pop it into the fabric like this. So this is my front notch here, so I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the back. And then we'll do the same for the other sleeve. Step 3 says to turn up the sleeve by 6 mil and then press. It's a very tiny little amount that, isn't it? 6 mil. We're going to repeat this ironing process of turning up the bottom of the sleeve by 6 mil on both sleeves. So let's do the second sleeve now. Once you've ironed the sleeve cuff, the instructions just ask us to stay stitch. So that is a basting stitch, a long stitch length, 4.5, 5 mil long. Just going to sew all the way around. And just repeat the same for the other sleeve. Next, we're going to be using our elastic to determine and to sew the cuffs of the sleeve. So have a look on the size chart again for the extension pack, and this is where you can see, according to your size, what length of elastic you should be using, and this includes your 1 cm seam allowance. So figure out what that is and cut out the appropriate length using your elastic. You may also just want to check by measuring about 3/4 of the way down your arm. This is a 3/4 length sleeve. Just make sure that that is about right for you, whatever the measurement was. For me, it was 24.4 centimetres. So yeah, with the seam allowance, that looks about right for me. So we've got our strips of elastic, and we're literally just going to overlap them by 1 centimetre. We're just going to stitch them in place on the sewing machine. And you may want to use a zigzag stitch for this. This can look quite messy, but don't worry about it because it's all going to be hidden inside your sleeve anyway. So as you can see, we've got some nice little zigzag stitches just holding that band of elastic all the way around, and that's going to sit on the bottom of our sleeve. So once you've done one, we're then just going to repeat the process with the second one. Our next step is to turn up the bottom of the sleeve at the notch on the pattern. So if you're not too sure, if you've overlocked your side seam and you're not too sure where that fold line should be, just refer back to your sewing pattern and mark it on again if necessary. And then just repeat that process for the other sleeve too. Now the instructions are asking us to encase the elastic into the sleeve before we then sew it in place. So this is possibly a little bit tricky, but we're going to give it a go. Just going to pin it so the seam is nicely matching up. So I'm pushing the elastic all the way up to the top where the fold is, and I'm literally just pinning right next to it so the elastic has no opportunity to move, but I am not pinning the elastic to the garment. Okay, so the elastic is now pinned in place to the sleeve casing with a whole series of pins. I'm going to do the same process on the other sleeve and then we'll sew them. So now that we've pinned in the casing, the elastic into the casing, we're now going to stitch a line of stitches over the stay stitching line that we stitched before. Okay, so we're going to stitch it right there all the way around, stretching out the elastic as we sew, and then it's all going to be distributed really nicely and evenly into that casing. It's going to look beautiful. Once you've done one, you can just repeat that process for the second one. Oh, those sleeves are just looking so cute now with their little elastic casing. Bit of a tricky detail, but taking your time with it, it makes it really look really, really good, doesn't it? Beautiful. Step 6 of the sleeve instructions are all about attaching the sleeve to the sleeve head here. So there's a number of different ways of doing this, and we'll show you one of them now. So the first thing we want to do is to find where the front of the sleeve is. So that was where our single notch was on the pattern. So this is the front of mine here. So I know that this one is actually going to fit onto this sleeve here. That's the front, and that's my front there. And so this sleeve is going to attach onto that side. Okay, so we'll do this one first. Move that one off to the side. I'm actually just going to pin, to start off with, the bottom of the sleeve onto the bottom of the armhole here. I'm just going to pin that in place, and I'm just going to line up the seam allowance just nice and neatly. Okay, so we know that that's how we want it to be. That's the first thing to do. At this point, I'm then just going to put the two pieces right sides together, and along the right side just want to start pinning underneath the arm here. Make sure that you pin that dart down. It's already been pressed down in a previous step, but just make sure you're pinning it down as well. Okay, and just pop a few extra pins in as you see fit. So I've only pinned up to the dart and the notch as well on the front, and on the back we added our two little notches, didn't we, from when we were doing our preparation gathering stitches. So we're just going to pin up to that point as well. So it's just a really small section that we're going to pin underneath the arm. Okay. So once we've done that, you'll notice we've got more fabric of the sleeve piece than we have of the actual bodice piece. So that's why we did these little gathering stitches to start off with as prep for our pattern development. So I want you to then line up the notch at the top of the sleeve head of the sleeve piece with the seam, with the top shoulder seam, like so. Pin that in place and just make sure that you're avoiding the stitches as you pin, because we may want to do some gathering along that area. Pull those gathering stitches so that you've got approximately the same circumference on your sleeve head as you have along your bodice sleeve opening. Once you've got that circumference about right, just pop in a whole load of pins. Great. Once you've pinned that sleeve in all the way around, we're then just going to sew it in place using a 1 centimetre seam allowance. I'm sewing the sleeve onto the bodice front with the bodice facing up on the sewing machine. The reason I'm doing that is simply because that means I can make sure that the bodice is sitting really nice and flat. I don't mind if we have a few gathers in the shoulder sleeve, that's fine. That's what our gathering stitches were for, just to allow that ease to come in. But I do want the bodice to sit nice and flat. All right, doesn't that look really cute? Got that sleeve in, let's do the next one. Once you've done that, turn it the wrong side facing out, and then we're just going to overlock that seam. And once you've overlocked the seam, we're then just going to press that seam towards the arm. looking so good. I cannot wait to get into that. It's looking amazing. So we've completely finished our bodice with our sleeves, and now we're going to sew the skirt onto the bodice. All right, let's go. Now then, at this point in the sewing process, we're going to go back to the original pattern instructions for the standard Montana midi dress. We're going to go back and start from step 7, which is the skirt and pockets. So step 7 of the original. We're going to sew the pocket pieces onto the skirt to start off with. So this is our skirt pattern piece here. This is the top and this is the bottom down here. We've got 2 little notches, one here and one here, which line up with our pocket notches. So we're just going to place one pocket on top of the skirt, lining it up with the notches on the pocket with the notches on the skirt, and just pin that in place. We're then going to do the same process but on the other side of the skirt. We're then going to sew both of those with a 1 centimetre seam allowance. You're going to start sewing the pocket onto the pocket piece where the notch is here, so following this stitch line down here to there, you're leaving a 1 centimetre gap at the top and the bottom of the pocket where you're not sewing. The instructions then say just to clip at the notches, which is here, taking that scissors all the way almost to the stitch line, and just repeat for the other side. We're then going to press that seam allowance towards the pocket and do the same on the other side. Once you've pressed it to the other side, we're just going to understitch this seam allowance to the pocket. So we've got that pressed that way, and we're just going to stitch it just to this side, just a couple of millimetres away from the folded edge here on the pocket side. We're going to start our row of stitching just 1 centimetre from the bottom of the pocket edge and stop 1 centimetre away from the top, basically when we hit the pocket notches. And the same on the other side. In step 8, it asks us to sew the second set of pockets onto our first ones. That's the wrong side. So we're going to do right sides together of the pockets. We're just going to line that up nicely with that. And then we're literally just going to pin all the way around the pocket, just pinning the pocket pieces together and not pinning through the actual skirt. So just lift it up as you go. Once you've done one pocket, let's do the same on the other side. Okay, we're now going to sew all the way from the edge, all the way around the pocket piece, just through the 2 layers of fabric, all the way around, and we'll do that on both sides using a 1 centimetre seam allowance. And just repeat that process for the other pocket. Once you've sewn your pockets in place, we're just going to overlock all the way around the curved edge, all the way around to the seams. Okay, so we've got our skirt front here, we've got our pocket here with space there for our hand to go through, but this side of the pocket is not yet sewn to the back skirt. So what we're going to do is we're going to get our back skirt piece and lay it on top of all of this. I'm going to push that pocket underneath like that. And we're going to lay the fabric on top. What this means is that when we stitch it, we're going to be sewing the back on top of the pocket, but making sure when we sew the seam down here, we're not catching the pocket edge into that seam. So it's quite a lot of precise sewing that we've got to do right now. So let's give it a go and use the pins to our advantage. So start pinning from the top, match up your notches. I'm just going to make sure that's pushed in under a little bit more, and I'm actually going to pin, rather than pin perpendicular to the seam allowance, I'm actually just going to pin along the seam allowance and make sure that the pocket is pushed to that side. So I'm definitely going to be stitching just the inside of that pin. There's so many different ways to insert pockets, aren't there? It's really interesting to have a pattern that does it slightly differently to maybe ways that you've seen it done before. So it's worth having a look at the instructions and making sure you really understand them. Okay, so we've pinned that whole side seam. We're now going to sew using a 1 centimetre seam allowance all the way down, making sure not to catch the pocket at this point. Once you've stitched that side seam, you might just want to check that your pocket is definitely not being caught. Let's take a look at that. Yep, that's absolutely fine. So we can see the pocket's in there. It's loose, I can get my hand in. So that's perfect. Okay, so once you've done one seam, we're then going to just do the other side seam in exactly the same way. Once you've sewn those side seams, we're just going to overlock them or finish them however you want. We're then going to press those seam allowances towards the back. If you're not sure which way the back is, it's easy to tell because you've done the understitching to the pocket on the front of the dress. So we're going to iron those towards the back. Okay, so we've now got our skirt. We've got our pockets attached to our skirt, which is great. This is the top of the skirt, and we're now going to insert gathering stitches to the top circumference of the skirt. Our stitches are only going to be sewn through one layer of fabric. We're going to start at one seam. We're going to leave a loose line of thread there. We're not going to reinforce the stitches when we start off with. We're then going to sew all the way around to the next seam. We're going to reinforce the stitch there a few times and then continue sewing all the way back to our original seam down here and leave a long line of thread. What that means is that when we pull on the thread on this side, it will only gather the stitches from here across to that seam. So we've got a nice even amount of stitches to gather there. And then we've reinforced the stitch line there. So then we're going to pull the threads at this end here and it will just gather the back of the skirt. So our gathering stitches should just be within the seam allowance. The first one we're going to sew at about 4mm from the raw edge, and then the second line of stitching will be about 8mm from the raw edge. Okay, so our sewing machine should have a long stitch length, should be about 5mm long, and off we go. So starting at one seam like this, I'm just going to sew straight off without reinforcing the stitch line, just through one layer of fabric and just 4mm off from the raw edge. Okay, I've now hit the side seam at this point. I'm going to go backwards and forwards just about 3 stitches on the seam, and then I'm just going to continue my line of stitches all the way to the original seam. Okay, so I've just hit the original seam that I started the stitch line at. I've not reinforced the stitch length at the end. I'm just going to take my needle up and pull out the skirt. I'm then going to cut the thread, leaving a reasonable allowance of thread there. And that's simply so that I can then pull that thread later to create a gathering stitch. Now we've done that once, we're now going to repeat that process another time, sewing a second line of stitches at around 8mm from the raw edge. Okay, so we're now going to attach the bodice to the skirt. Just make sure you know which side is the skirt front by just checking your pockets to see which side you understitched on. So my front of my skirt is this one. So I'm going to want to put the front of my bodice, which is this side, in that way. Okay, so we want to do right sides together. We're going to put our bodice into the skirt and we're going to have the bodice bottom is upside down right now. We're going to grab hold of the raw edges. We're just going to shove that into the skirt like that. And the raw edge of the waist of the bodice is there, and it's just going to line up really nicely with the side seams of the skirt. So line up the bodice side seams with the bodice skirt, and you can see that obviously the skirt has a lot more volume and circumference of fabric compared to the bodice. That's normal, and that's why we did our gathering stitches. So first of all, just get the side seam of the bodice and pin it to the side seam of the skirt on one side. Make sure that your seam allowances are pushed to the correct side, which is towards the back. And then go across to the other side seam and do the same. Okay, so we're just going to find the 2 strands of thread on this side which are loose, not been reinforced, and it's just the 2 strands from the 2 lines that we've done along the top. I'm just going to pull on those and push those gathers really gently along the skirt. Just keep checking to make sure that your skirt length is the same as the length of your bodice piece. Just give it a few checks every now and again. Do you need to pull it in a little bit more? Do you need to pull it out a little bit more? That's beginning to look okay actually for me. And once you feel like your skirt length is about right, just tie the ends of those pieces of thread in a little knot, so it just prevents the gathers from undoing themselves and coming out the end of the fabric. At this point, you just want to evenly distribute the gathers along the skirt. It's quite hard to get it absolutely perfect, so don't worry if it's not quite 100% perfect. Once you've sewn it, it will all sort of come into, it will all start moving around anyway, and when you're wearing it, it's obviously going to look slightly different as well. So once you're reasonably happy with how that's looking, you then just want to pin the skirt to the front bodice only. Okay, and then just repeat that whole process on the other side of the skirt. In order to get a really nice smooth finish of gathers, there's one extra little step that you can do if you want to. You can simply baste the skirt to the bodice using a long stitch length, so 4.5, 5mm long, and you can do that within the seam allowance, so 8mm maybe away from the raw edge. And then that just helps to distribute the gathers just a little bit more evenly before you then do your final finishing stitch all the way around using your standard stitch length of 2.5mm. So if you want to do this extra added little step, then feel free. This is an absolute classic time for your bobbin to run out of thread, so just keep an eye on it as you do this line of stitching. Okay, so once you've sewn that basting line of stitches all the way around the top, you can then sew standard seam allowance of 1 centimetre to sew the top to the bottom, and your gathers should be beautifully distributed by now. And once you've sewn your skirt to the bodice, we can then just finish with an overlocker or using your preferred method. Once you've overlocked the waist seam, you'll then just want to press the seam however it sort of wants to sit. Yeah, we're going to press the seam allowance down actually at the front here. Can you see it sort of wanting to go down because of the amount of facing that we've got going on here? We've done so well with this. We're actually on to the last step now, which is really exciting. So this is going to be to hem the bottom of the skirt. So the instructions literally just say hem the skirt. So you can do that in whichever way you want to. You could just simply overlock the raw edge, press it up and stitch in place. That would be absolutely fine. You can also press under some of the seam allowance by about 6mm and then press under again and then just finish off that stitch nicely. That is a really nice, neat way of finishing your hem. You do have a marker on the pattern which sort of suggests an appropriate hem line, but as always, this is your garment and your dress, so go and try the dress on before you decide your hem length. Check you're happy with the hem length and then come back and hem it. For me, I want a nice, neat finish for mine, so I'm going to iron it under, and then under one more time. Okay, so for the hem on my skirt, I've rolled the fabric under by about 1 centimetre and then rolled it back under again, and I've ironed it in place. So we're going to sew the dress with the right side facing up, the hemline folded underneath. We're going to use the top stitching stitch length, which is 1.8mm long, and we're going to sew all the way around. Don't forget to check your bobbin. Off we go. So here is the finished version, completely done. Looking absolutely gorgeous in our Minerva Exclusive fabric. It's got a lot of flow and drapes, some gorgeous pockets. And the sleeves just work really well with the elastic, wearing them 3/4 or up at your elbows. The fabric is just so drapey and gorgeous. These colours are just stunning. And the length of it is midi length here, but obviously you can make it whatever length you want. So a huge well done for completing your Montana midi dress. I hope you really enjoy styling it. As always, we love to see your creations here at Minerva, so do create a free account on our website, upload your photos so you can share that with the community. We always love to see what different fabrics look like and the different versions that you make. Don't forget that with this pack you've got 12 different types of dresses you can make, so once you've made one and figured out the fit, then off you go. So thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you really enjoyed the sew along, and we'll see you again.